Welcome back to Communicology. Today I'd like to talk about something that's been pretty well evident in the news for the past 2 years, and it's only getting worse. And it's something that matters to me as a college professor, and it might matter to you as either a person who's viewing it, as a parent, or as a grandparent, depending how old you are watching this. And that is the plight of Gen Z and how they are handling the entire process of moving to work and what's happening with them once they get to work. Because there have been some alarming articles that keep popping up every couple months, and it's something that bears some discussion and figuring out how can we help this generation move forward in their lives. So let's talk about some of those things. Now, depending on the article, depending on who's doing the surveying, right out of the box, we've seen anything from 20 to 50 to 77% of Gen Zs are taking a parent with them to a job interview. Now, someone who's in Generation X, we can't even process this thought. And quite frankly, millennials don't either. And it's just one of those things that it's hard for us to even fathom why. Well, the truth of it is it's kind of built into them. It's easy to make fun of Gen Z for doing this, but the truth of it is somebody raised them. So when you go back and look at their parents, how did their parents take care of them? Now, I've talked before about the concept of the snowplow parent, and this is where this comes into play yet again. And that's the idea that, instead of a helicopter parent where parents are kind of hovering to make sure that everything's okay, the snowplow parent comes in and clears the total path, makes it as smooth as possible. And you can understand why they would do that. I don't want my kids to have any kind of hardship, so I'm going to do these things for them. The problem is they never let them do things on their own anyway. So even the slightest inconvenience, they have problem, processing and figuring out how to do. And I've seen that numerous times. I once knew this 18-year-old getting ready to head out to college who didn't even know how to make toast. I'm not kidding. Toast. Not like, how to make the best toast or anything like that. He didn't even know that you used a toaster. He thought you just put bread in the microwave and you got toast. He genuinely didn't know because his mother did everything for him. And that becomes a problem, obviously, because, well, that's an easy thing in life. What about hard things, about paying bills, about trying to determine, which, job career prospect to follow first? And those are real life issues, how to solve workplace, dissatisfaction issues. That's a big part of life. And if you don't even know how to make toast, oh my goodness. So you think about the people who have had those snowplow parents who've cleared the way for everything. They don't know how to handle a single thing. The second problem that comes into play too is we're seeing the results of what we call the iPad kids come into play, where as soon as they were little, instead of parents having to deal with them, they just shove an iPad, an iPhone, or some other phone or whatever in their faces just to always placate them. You've seen them. You're going at Walmart and parents pushing the cart around, the kid's sitting there just staring at a phone the whole time in the cart. Or you go to a restaurant and they prop up a phone or an iPad, just so the kid has something to watch, just so they'll stay quiet. So instead of teaching them how to sit still, how to be conversant, they just learn everything from the screen. And think what happens, as a child develops, because you think of language issues that come to play with this. And not just that, communication issues that come to play, because whenever you're teaching a child to speak, you're getting down face to face with them and saying, what does the cow say? The cow says moo. And there's that interaction. They can see in 3D your lips going moo. They can even put their hand on your mouth when you go moo, so they can feel it, and they get that. You don't get that from a screen. So you end up having these situations where kids are being raised by screens, and as a result, they can't do this interpersonal communication, this talking one-to-one. So they can't handle problems. They can't do interpersonal communication. What do you think a job interview is? It's 20 minutes to an hour, maybe even 2 hours, depending on the interview, of face-to-face communication with rapid-fire questions that they have to solve right now. That's terrifying, especially when you throw in the concept of like how we use our phones. You've heard the concept of someone being left on read, which means you read the message, they get the notification you read the message, and then you just don't reply because I'll think of a response later so I can craft it up a good response and send it out. Well, we know why you're waiting. You're just trying to come up with something to say. Just answer the question, deal with the situation. You can't do that in a job interview. If they ask you a question, you have to answer it. You can't say, well, I'll get back to you in a week. I mean, you need to tell them right then. So you put all those things together and you can see why Gen Z is wholly unequipped for job interviews and why it would be terrifying. Now, what's really bad is people, whether it's, college professionals or parents or friends or whoever, no one's really doing a good job of shepherding them and preparing them. Like, this is what you need to be ready for a job interview, and then help them and guide them through it. But also because Gen Z isn't very big on asking questions. If they want answers, they'll turn to influencers who are basically other Gen Zers who are making these little TikTok videos about how to do stuff. So instead of actually having engaging conversation and saying, but what about, and talking with people who are older and more experienced, they're talking to each other and they're giving each other bad advice. So this is leading to all these problems that are just snowballing, and it starts at the interview. So like I said, some surveys have it as high as 77% are taking a parent with them to a job interview, and that could be in person or remote. Either way, a parent's there. Like, what are you going to do? Be with that your kid during the job? And the answer is yes. Surveys have also showed that a lot of parents have kind of injected themselves in, or the kids have brought them in to the job process, to where they're negotiating pay or pay raises. They're negotiating and helping with benefits. They're helping with interpersonal relationships at work. It's like at some point there has to be a divorce. I mean, it used to be that you would turn 18 and you'd kind of be on your own. And because you would have been learning all of these different responsibilities. So when you turned 18, you could be on your own. And quite frankly, in my generation, when we turned 18, we couldn't wait to be on our own. The thought of inviting a parent to a job interview is mortifying to us because, well, we wanted to be on our own. We wanted to go and test our mettle in the world. It's to cut that cord early, is a big thing for Generation X. And of course, every generation is different. I get that in the way that we're raised. I get that. But the thing is no one is helping Gen Z cut that cord. So that's a major thing we have to deal with. So what about when they actually get to work? Well, that hasn't been going really well either. Like I said, parents are involving themselves. But once you just looking at Gen Z and Gen Z only, some of the things that start to pop up. For example, in an article in Fortune magazine, it said that 1 in 7 bosses have admitted they may avoid hiring Gen Z altogether next year. 1 in 7. In other words, they don't like Gen Z workers so much that 1 in 7 won't even think of hiring them. What they're doing is they're going back and finding a millennial or a Gen Xer, and they're willing to pay more. Like, I'll pay a Gen Xer who's 45, 55 years old more money just so I don't have to deal with it. And that's what they're doing. It says 3/4 of the companies surveyed said some or all of their recent graduate hires were unsatisfactory in some way. Now, this goes beyond the idea of unsatisfactory as in there were any problems whatsoever, because every new employee has problems, and anyone who's ever hired somebody, what that's like. You have to train them. They're going to be rough around the edges. They're going to be bumpy. They're going to make some mistakes. Employers know that. But we're talking profoundly problematic, to where 3/4 said that some or all of their graduates were unsatisfactory in some way. I mean, that's devastating. I mean, 75% said they're bad. So that's terrible. So what's the problem we have? So let's go through some of these things that get in the way. It says employers' gripe with young people today is their lack of motivation or initiative. 50% of the leaders surveyed cited that as a reason why they didn't work out with the new hire. Lacking motivation. I mean, I see it every day in college classes with Gen Z students. The desire to read. I mean, it's gone. They don't have it. Either they don't know how or they don't want to. But either way, it's gone. Getting to read an article, forget a book, just an article, if you give them some little thing, a little blurb, a paragraph, they won't do it. They just won't do it. They're just not interested. They won't do it. I know that sounds weird. If you're anyone who's older than Gen Z, that sounds really weird to you. That's just what we're dealing with because they're so used to being constantly entertained by their phones. It's just constant flashing images and entertainment. So to actually sit and read requires turning off the phone and relying on the mind, the memory, the imagination, everything working in concert to move through that paragraph or through the chapter or through a book. And, I have to basically have quizzes almost every day to force them to read. So there's a reading quiz I'll start the class with just to get them to read. And even then, they don't read that much. If they can get an electronic copy, they'll ask ChatGPT to do a summary of the chapter for them so they don't have to even focus, or they could ask ChatGPT, give me the main points of this chapter. That's just what they'll do. They have no desire to put any effort in and read. And that's just reading. So when it comes to actually doing any kind of work, they just don't. They strive to do the bare minimum. So I'll have them do a project. So we'll do like some kind of special project in one of my classes, and it's not too terribly hard, but they'll do the very bare minimum. Like the idea, like, oh, I'm going to go above and beyond, is just not in their vocabulary. And that's a terrible way that they've been raised, to do just the bare minimum. And some of that happens because of parents. Some of it happens because of our government school system. Because in the government school system, they're required to pass them. In many, many, many schools, they're required to pass them no matter what. So they could turn in nothing and still get a 60%. Some schools are forbidden from giving out Fs. So if you have a kid in government school, it's very possible that's what's going on. And kids aren't stupid. They know that if they do just the absolute bare minimum, they're going to get an A or a B. So when I give a student back an assignment after I grade it and they get a C, they don't understand because they turned it in. That's worth an A. It's like, no, it's wrong, and they don't understand what wrong is. They just know they just turned it in, therefore they deserve an A, because if they didn't turn it in, that's when they get to a C or a D. So they don't get the idea of initiative. And also, when parents expect them to do nothing, guess what they do? Nothing. So if initiative means sitting on the couch and playing video games all day, go out and do this, go do that. The idea of doing chores, growing up, like go pick up sticks, go mow the yard, go help the lady across the street, shovel her sidewalk, all that stuff. If you don't expect that of children, they don't expect much of themselves. People in general revert to the bare minimum if they give the chance. So that's one problem there. Also, it says, bosses point out how Gen Z is unprofessional, unorganized, having poor communication skills as some of the reasons to fire graduates. And this is a crazy thing to think about too, but it's not unlikely. And from what I've seen as a college professor, like I've had students for a final presentation of the semester, like the big presentation worth all the points, show up in sweats. One kid one time, I'll always remember this, he showed up wearing Spider-Man shorts. It's like, at what point do you think that that's like even remotely good for a presentation? I mean, it's one thing if you're coming to class in your sweats, but to show up for your final presentation, and you surely think, well, it's just because they know they're in college. That's all they're going to do is just college. But when they get out in the real world, they'll get it right there, right? And according to this article, no, actually they don't. They show up and they're unprofessional in their behavior and unprofessional in their language and unprofessional in their dress. So they show up dressed very poorly for work. And if you're trying to land a $5 million deal with some clients, you can't show up in sweats. How incredibly disrespectful. I've talked about that before in my other episode dealing with how to properly dress and what that conveys to other people. But again, if you have the way you dress is unprofessional, and then you look at the way that you carry yourself, and that's very much unprofessional, showing up on time. I was always raised that if you show up 10 minutes early, that's on time. If you show up on time, you're late. Students today, they will just roll into class at the absolute last second, not the last minute, the last second. And they think that as long as they're in the building or in the parking lot, at the start of class, that's good enough. It's like, no, you need to be in your seat ready to go at the start of class. So I take attendance at the very beginning of class. Like as soon as the dial clicks to 0, I take attendance. And if they're not in their seat, they're marked absent or late. And they wonder why their grades are dropping. It's like it's important for you to learn to be in your seat. Maybe your boss at work won't care if you stroll in, but eventually you're going to come across a client that you're trying to impress. They're going to care that you're late. So it's important that they learn, be on time, be punctual. And sometimes they just don't get it. And then also when it comes to unprofessionalism, the language. I got students routinely, they just use, whatever language comes out of their mouth and they just think it's no big deal. This is weird because this is the generation that acts so offended about things and how they're offended, but they don't mind using the language that offends other people. So it's a weird thing. Again, it's a bit narcissistic, obviously, that don't offend me, but I can say whatever I want. And if it offends you, that's your problem. That's a problem, or they just try to say, well, it's just a cultural thing. It's just how I do things. It's like, that's not how it works because you're now in a new culture. In the culture of our work environment, you don't talk like this. When you're meeting with a client, you don't talk like this. And they just don't. It's not that they don't get it. They just don't care to change. And that's a problem. That's also a very big problem. Because it's important to learn not just the language of the trade, all the different special terms and things like that have to happen for learning a trade, but also having that language of professionalism. The words that you use carry the day. This goes all the way back, though, to the point about not reading. We learn, as I said in that one video I did about the importance of reading, if you don't read, your language is going to be limited. And if your language development is just going to be what I've heard on TikTok from fellow friends, you're going to be constantly stuck at this level of basic language. You're never going to grow and grow and grow. It's when you read difficult works that you have to learn a new language set. So I got students, I try to have them read stuff, and this has happened before. I've assigned books that students complain about how hard it is. And I would tell them, this book was written for college students in the 1950s. They understood it clearly. What does that say about us that you can't understand it now? Because it's very basic language, but they don't get it because they're stuck forever in this TikTok range of talking like they're forever 18. And there's never a push to learn more. There's never an exposure to more. So without reading, their communication skills, they go out the window. Without having to do the face-to-face stuff, their communication skills go out the window. So all these things are piling up to the point where it's just not tenable for them to stay in the workplace. So we see these kind of things having problems because what happens then, the people seem to be like they're not good fits, and they end up getting fired at record numbers. And there's been lately a lot of articles written about how Gen Z workers are getting fired at record numbers. So this Fortune article says, now more than half of hiring managers have come to the conclusion that college grads are unprepared for the world of work, and over 20% say they can't handle the workload. So your basic concept of I can't do the work, it's too much, is now very high. And that's mind-boggling to everybody except for people who like our college professors, because we see it all the time. Just read these 15 pages and they can't. They won't. I mean, they can, but they won't. So if I'm just asking them to read 10 pages, 15 pages, maybe even 20 pages, they won't do it. And then that's just me. And then there's all my other colleagues who are asking them to do this basic things. Do this worksheet, do this. They just won't. And I even had somebody on a test ask, well, when you write up your test, can you give us like a word bank? It's like a word bank. We had those when I was in 5th grade. This is college. I'm at a university. We don't have word banks on tests. At least we shouldn't. And shame on any colleagues who do, because again, they need to have command of things, and they just don't understand that the real world is actually another step harder. It's not like they think of college as this box I have to check. Previous generations said this is another step on the ladder, so I have to do this step and then this step. And you understand as you climb a ladder, it's harder. You have to require effort to go up to the next step. This is just a checkbox. So we're in this generation of I just have to check off the box because society says I go to college, check. Then I go and do my work, check. It's not that simple. I have to have effort. I have to grow. I have to learn. And you end up seeing, like I said, record numbers of Gen Z employees getting fired, many of them in the first year, many of them in the first month, because they just can't cut it. Now, this is a disservice to this generation. Again, it's easy to make fun of Gen Z, but the truth of it is they're taught this. They've been shepherded this way by previous generations, and we've got to stop it. We've got to try to help them while we can, and then help the next generation, Gen Alpha, and now the babies that are being born this year, Gen Beta. So we have to be mindful of all of these children that are coming, that they need to be trained up. They need to be trained up, because if we just try to coddle them like we did with Gen Z and to some extent with millennials, we're going to end up with some great disaster in this country and around the world, because we need people who can communicate, who can think, who can show initiative. Otherwise, we're going to be grounded forever in a perpetual state of being 18 years old. And that doesn't sound like fun to me. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thank you very much for tuning in this long anyway. But we'll see you next time on Communicology.